Welcome to Linux Conscious Game Development, also known as How Not to Piss Off the Penguins. For the first time in my life, I have structured a PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully this one actually makes sense. I will apologize in advance if at any point I seem to come off very strong or direct. That's not intentional. I just talk that way, but I will be talking some trash about companies I don't like. So if you are a fan of EA or Ubisoft, leave now. Moving on. Weaponized assault penguins. You don't want this. This is not a thing you want, but it's okay. I'm here for you. I can help you prevent this problem. First question. Who the heck am I? Name's Dev, Vice President, RIT Linux Users Group. Haven't booted Windows in like some number of years. That counts as a flex to me. Point being, I do all of my James on Linux, so I feel like I know what I'm talking about here. I'm going to break this down into 6 sections. Section 1, what this presentation isn't, because I'm sure there are at least 3 or 4 people right now who are already trying to like play psychic mind games, trying to figure out what I'm about to say next. 2, popular myths, things you hear all the time. I'm going to debunk some myths, and I'm going to talk about why you should actually care about producing your games with the Linux crowd in mind. I also like to go over some general rules of development, just things you can stick to give yourself a good starting point and maybe even a good stopping point. I've got some specific advice for indies, specific advice for your big budget AAA, AA titles with over 100 people working on the project, and I've got a little surprise at the end. So to begin, what is this not? This is not me demanding you to make all of your games run natively on Linux. That's just a little too much to ask for with where the market is right now. I'm also not going to insist that all game developers should just completely ignore Windows. Windows users make up more than half of all PCs, and that's a much higher percentage when we're talking about people who play games. So to ask that would be absurd. I'm not going to ask that. This is not also an accusation or an attempt at ridicule, unless, of course, you are the CEO of EA, in which case, be ready to be ridiculed. I'm absolutely not demanding that you use Linux to develop your games. If you want to, that's really cool. I encourage that. That's great. You can use Windows. You can use macOS. I don't care. I'm simply asking you to keep in mind a certain subset of the market while you develop your games. And it's really easy. It sounds like rocket science. This presentation is going to make it sound like rocket science, but if you actually stop and think about it, stuff is simple. So let's break down some myths. Here's the big one. Let's get the elephant out of the room. Linux is irrelevant in the gaming space. You hear this in 150 different ways, but this is what it boils down to. But polls suggest that Linux may be poised to explode in popularity among gamers. Get ahead of the curve while you can. Get some practice developing for this before you're behind the market. Let's look at the Humble Bundle. I stole this from Wikipedia. Linux users make up roughly an eighth of all purchases on the Humble Bundle. And more interestingly, they make up nearly a quarter of the money made from donations. So Linux people have money, and clearly they want to spend it. Give them the reason to spend it. Give them your games. Here's a giant graph of Steam users on Linux. The blue line is overall, barely even over 1%, just barely crossed that line a couple months ago. But if you just look at the English-speaking users, it's actually been over the 1.5% line for a long time, went briefly over the 2% line. But the thing I want to focus on here is the fact that it's growing. The number is only getting bigger. I've got a couple links up top here. First, the straw poll link. Some 5,000, maybe it was 5,700 respondents. 78% said if you ignore the games, Linux is their favorite operating system. 78%. It was not even close. It's not even fair. So clearly, people want to use Linux. It's just that the games are stopping them. And this thread on the PC Master Race subreddit sort of confirms that. Not the greatest sample. PC Master Race being the kind of people they are and only having some 300 respondents. But it's still worth considering. There are a lot of people in that thread who said something to the effect of, if my games worked, I would jump Windows immediately. I've had enough of this stupid operating system. Let's talk about some more myths. Myth number 2, Linux users make up less than 5% of my customer base, but they make up over 80% of my bug reports. There was a Twitter thread that got popular a little while ago. A game developer posted he was never going to make games for Linux again, and somebody teased him in the replies. You would make games for a Roku, a smart TV, and a toaster running NetBSD, but you wouldn't make your games for Linux? And his response was unironically yes, because the Linux users were such a small minority of my customers, but they kept reporting graphics bugs. I gotta tell you, this is a knock on bad engines. This is a sign that the engine in question isn't a very good engine. Here's the deal. When Linux users have a significant problem with some game running, the first question that the kind of people who would hopefully spend a little bit of time thinking about this. Of course, there are people who just see something go wrong and they start kicking and screaming and shitting themselves, but let's not talk about those guys. Plenty of people, they see something goes wrong and they say, okay, what's the problem here? My other games, do they work? Yeah, my other games work just fine. Are my graphics drivers up to date? Yes, my graphics drivers are up to date. Is my kernel up to date? Yes, my kernel's up to date. Have I rebooted recently? No, let me reboot. Okay, problem still persists. Must be a problem with the game. And then they send a bug report to your game. So if you're getting 80% of bug reports from people saying, all of my other games work except for yours, reporting graphics driver errors, what the heck is going on? It's your engine. It's not Linux. Another myth. Why should I spend hours and hours of my time perfecting this game for minority operating system when all that time could be spent perfecting the game on the majority operating system? And you know what? This is a legitimate question. I needed to sit down and think about this one for a little while before I had a good answer. At first, I thought the answer was just, well, if you're thinking of cross-platform, your code will be better. Generally, things made with multiple operating systems in mind tend to be programmed a little bit better. But per the prior polls, Windows only has a supermajority for so long, I feel. I really think the only reason holding back the onslaught of movement from Windows to Linux in the gaming space is the fact that there are no developers, at least not enough developers, really thinking about Linux. Why aren't these developers thinking about Linux? Because no one uses Linux. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. Thankfully, Valve in the past couple of years has been taking some very impressive strides in finding a way to circumvent this death loop, but we'll get to that momentarily. I think this is the last myth. I know literally nothing about Linux dev. How am I supposed to plan and test my game for an environment I don't understand? Perfectly legitimate question. I could be snarky about this and say, just install Linux and learn it, bro. It's not that hard. I'm not going to be like that. If all else fails, design around Proton. If you've never heard of Proton, that's the Valve thing I mentioned in the previous slide. Essentially, it's Wine, a translation layer, translates Windows to Linux API calls on the fly. It's Wine and a whole bunch of other programs designed to help Windows games run on Linux, all packaged into one, specifically built into Steam in a way that works with Steam. So literally any game on Steam, even if it's not released on Linux, you can install it on Linux and you can try to run it, and Proton will do its best. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it takes a little effort on the user's part. I can tell many stories there. And sometimes it just doesn't work at all. But we'll get to those later because those are the interesting points. But if you really don't know anything about Linux, you just want to make a game, design around Proton. Think in terms of Wine. General rules. Rule number 1, guys, I got great news. If you're using most mass market engines, you're fine. This problem solves itself. Godot builds games natively for Linux. Unity 4 and beyond, native. Unreal Engine, every version of Unreal since the original, natively builds games on Linux. Source has recently seen an explosion in Linux support. CryEngine 3.4 added Linux support. These are all great engines. You can just use them. And if you're using them, I really see no reason why you can't just export Linux binary and have everything work there. You could literally upload your game to Steam and say, I didn't test this. and I'm not reading bug reports, but I had Unity make a Linux binary. I hope it works. People would at least thank you for trying. Rule number 2, a Valve by Steam Deck recommendations. I would be surprised if this page didn't exist under a different URL previously, but essentially with the Steam Deck coming out and the Steam Deck being based on Linux and using Proton for everything, Valve made a list of ideas that game developers should be thinking about if they want their games to work as nicely as possible on Steam Deck. And these are all really good ideas, so I decided to just collate them. First of all, try not to use .NET. There are implementations of .NET that do work nicely on Linux. .NET 5 is cross-platform, right from Microsoft. .NET versions prior to 5, you can find an implementation in Mono. But more often than not, if you're designing things, UIs and such with .NET from the start, it's just not going to work all that well over Wine. We've tried. 2, avoid Media Foundation. I understand why you want to use it. It's good stuff. But they don't work on Wine at all. There is a patch. Many people use it. But using that patch is technically piracy. You really don't want your users to have to pirate your game to play your game. And I'm going to have to bring that one up later in a couple sides down. So, don't encourage them to break the law. Just avoid the Media Foundation stuff. Find other libraries, find other tools, write some stuff yourself. There are plenty of alternatives out there. Anti-cheat. You're going to have to tread this one lightly. Anti-cheat and Wine, they just don't go together. Valve and Codeweavers, the team that designed Wine, they're really trying hard to get anti-cheat working perfectly in Wine. Excuse me. By the time the Steam Deck releases, there are rumors that they've already got it finished and they're just kind of polishing it up at this point. And I would not be surprised if that were untrue. I remember hearing somewhere that they found a way to implement a Wine call that can handle Ring 0 code, but it's not released yet. So for now, I just have to say, tread anti-cheat lightly. The good news, and literally this is news as of like the past couple of days, various previously Windows-only anti-cheats are being reworked specifically to support Proton for the Steam Deck. BattlEye, Easy Anti-Cheat. What's the other big one? The name is kind of is eluding me right now, but there are some really big, popular anti-cheats that are finally starting to come around to the Linux space. If you have to use an anti-cheat, prefer user space or server-side solutions. Overwatch works great on Linux because all of its anti-cheat is done at the Blizzard servers. Most games that use anti-cheat these days try to do everything at the kernel level, which is concerning not only because it doesn't work very well on Wine yet, but also because people kind of feel a little back and forth ethically about it. I know I'm pretty touchy. You're asking me to run proprietary code that has kernel level control over my entire system. Dude, just trust me? Yeah, that's a bit of a question. But definitely avoid the kernel space stuff. If you do that, you can at least get your game probably maybe working on Wine. Easy Anti-Cheat and BattlEye are kernel level. Shout out to Valorant for having the absolute worst anti-cheat. I don't know if they ever changed this, but at least on launch, Valorant's anti-cheat had kernel level root control over your entire system. It started when you booted Windows and you couldn't turn it off. That's not an anti-cheat. That's a rootkit. And if you're developing that, either A, you're a security researcher showing a huge exploit in an operating system, and you publish it to GitHub and you make huge money from Microsoft because you found a huge bug, or you're a bad person because you're trying to hack people, and that's super no bueno. So please do not make rootkits and call them anti-cheats. Next, anti-tamper, copy protection, DRM, whatever you want to call it, they're not your friends. And this is probably the touchiest thing I'm going to say in this entire presentation. But even Valve is saying, if you want it to work on Wine, you don't got to do this. Anti-tamper always makes your game's performance run slower or causes some other compatibility, bugs, problems, you name it. but especially on Wine, they just don't behave. Many games work exceptionally well if you find pirated versions that removed all the DRM. Several Call of Duty games are like this. Doom 2016 was like this until they released a patch that removed de novo anti-tamper about a year after launch. Of course, from a business perspective, not putting anti-tamper is ridiculous. You're just begging people to pirate at that point. So tread lightly. Rule number 3, just run it. Install Ubuntu and run it. See if it works. Ask questions. Does it work natively? If not, if it does, what kind of bugs are OS dependent? Maybe there's something that works perfectly well in your Windows build, but your Linux build, which has the same code, there's just something not quite there. Research it, find it, fix it. Question number 2, okay, it didn't work natively. Did it require Proton or some other kind of build of Wine? Why might that be? What other work do players need to put in? There are tons of games you just hit play on Steam and everything works. It's great. On the other side, there are games that just won't until you put up a fight for hours. Anyone who's tried to run Titanfall 2 on Linux knows what I'm talking about. I literally had to go into the game's configuration for the Origin launcher, set the Origin launcher to borderless full screen, load it, go into the settings, change it back to non-full screen, run the game, close the game, disable write permissions in the game directory, then boot it up again, and even then it's a coin toss whether it'll work. Please, please do not make people go through hell just to get your game to run, which is why you test it. I know, sounds condescending, but for sake of completeness, I have to put it in. It's also worth asking, how simple is it to install? In theory, I should just be able to download and install your game. Maybe it's on Steam, maybe it's got an installer of some kind, but sometimes that's not the case. Overwatch is an absolute pain to install, but thankfully somebody worked out all the details and made a script for Lutris, which is a popular game launcher alternative program, a Lutris script that just handles all the hard work for you. So Overwatch is actually really easy to install on Linux once somebody got the details worked out. I have also had games where I had to sacrifice a goat to Cthulhu to make it work, just to install it even. Really, that's kind of excessive. Bonus points if you test on Sway. If you've never heard of Sway, you can ignore this line. If you do know what Sway is, cool. You should probably test on that, see what happens. I have been playing a lot of Yakuza 0 recently, and it doesn't like Sway at all. It fights tooth and nail. I can't even move over to my second monitor without the game also moving over to the second monitor, which makes responding to Discord messages a little difficult. I don't blame the Yakuza developers for this. Testing anything on Sway is just one of those who would do that kind of things at the moment. But I thought I'd throw it in there just as a fun little story to break up the pace. Rule number 4, avoid launchers. Launchers are number 3 on the most frequent causes of trouble for Linux gamers after anti-tamper and anti-cheat. This stuff just doesn't work for some reason, and I can't figure out why. In theory, everything should just handle itself. Wine can handle launchers. There are plenty of games that work with them. But for some reason, it just happens to be a problem. Frankly, I am also of the opinion that if you can put it on a launcher, you can just put it in your game's options. I really don't see what that extra executable is going to do for you. It's adding another file to my system. It's adding more code, more forms, more rendering, more nonsense that I really don't see the point to. But from the perspective of somebody who plays games on Wine, from the perspective of somebody who plays games on Wine, what does that extra exe even get you? The answer is crashes on Wine. Popular example, Victoria 2, a grand strategy game by Paradox Interactive. For the longest time, the actual Wine fix was to delete the launcher and rename the game exe to the name of the launcher exe so that Steam launched that first. And the game works. It didn't work for me, but many people said you just remove the launcher and everything handles itself. Rule number 5, prefer cross-platform tools. This kind of extends on what I was saying earlier about the importance of thinking about multiple operating systems in the get-go. Qt GTK Plus 3, cross-platform. WinForms is not. Vulkan is really, really cool. If you've never looked into Vulkan, I highly encourage it, especially if you're the kind of person who likes to read technical documentation and try out weird stuff. Vulkan is a competitor to DirectX 12. It's open source. It's cross-platform. It's really, really neat. Several of the engines I brought up earlier, CryEngine has Vulkan in beta. Unity, Unreal, both have Vulkan. Godot is working on it. It'll be in the next major release. Source is maybe going to use Vulkan. I think they moved Dota 2 onto Vulkan instead of DirectX, but other games like CSGO, they're kind of iffy on right now. If you're going to be working with graphics card development companies about tools to use, try working more with AMD and their tools. It's branches more into the topic of, you know, companies being rude to each other. But at the end of the day, NVIDIA has not been kind to the Linux kernel development team and to Linux users as a whole. AMD has been really great to work with. They're so helpful, and everything they do just kind of works. So if you're going to use really nice hair effects, prefer AMD's Tress Effects to NVIDIA's Hairworks, and things will just handle themselves a lot better, especially on Wine. If you're running Unity and you're sorry, not Unity. If you're using Unreal and all of your C++ files start with #include windows.h, just saying, it's probably not going to build native on Linux. You can try. I don't think it's going to work. Wine can handle the Windows API. That's literally what it was designed to do. But the more you depend on the Windows API directly, the more you have to depend on Wine, which means the more your game slows down. On the flip side, you can find cross-platform tools and libraries that implement the actual behavior you want. And if you use those instead, then it doesn't matter what kernel is under the hood. Everything kind of handles itself. I want to pick up the pace a little bit here. I promise I'm I'm almost done. Indies, I got bad news. You guys are running out of excuses. Unity 4, 5, Unreal, very little effort required to handle Linux. Basically just export the game and don't rely entirely on the Windows API. Godot looks like a meme. It's actually just as serious as these juggernauts. I had a small conversation with Kent Reese on Twitter some weeks ago about this. And with Godot very, very soon releasing the alpha of version 4, which will use Vulkan rendering, super cool. Can't make the Vulkan argument as soon as that one's out, but if you want to make the Vulkan argument now for why you use Unreal and Unity, that's cool. I totally support that kind of meme. Also, consider that Linux users, especially for indie developers, will be your most ardent fans. You just have to give them a little salami as a treat. You make a game, you test it, maybe it works on Wine, maybe it works on Linux natively, whichever, you release it, and you just say, hey, I tested the game on Linux, it works. They'll be back for more. And they'll tell all their friends, hey, you should buy this game. This developer cares about the Linux community. It's the smallest thing. I saw this happen with Dusk, New Blood Interactive. It was not intended for Linux development at all, but the game was built in Unity 5. The developer wasn't doing anything stupid. It worked perfectly fine on Proton, and basically everyone said, hey, can you make a Linux native build? And he went, okay, I'll make a Mac OS build while I'm at it. So just know that we're right behind you as long as you give us ground to stand on. It sounds way, way tackier than it needs to be. At the very least, I do think an indie developer should be aiming to run natively on Ubuntu 2004. Will you nail it? Will you fail it? Doesn't matter. Aim for that goal. Even if you aim for the moon, if you miss, you'll shoot it, you'll still land among the stars, that kind of thing. Ubuntu 2004 is just one of, if not the most popular particular flavors of Linux used for gaming. Basically every Steam game that has Linux native and the system requirements, it says Ubuntu. If you can run it on Ubuntu, the kinds of people who don't use Ubuntu know enough about what they're doing that they can do the rest of the work themselves. I use a really weird distribution. All of my games basically say, hey, if you're not using Ubuntu, I'm not reading your bug reports. But I'm okay with that because I kind of know what I'm doing. If it runs on Ubuntu, I can make it work. More often than not, I don't even need to make it work. On the other hand, if you are the Blackmagic Studios and you're developing DaVinci Resolve, screw you. Big budget studios. Honestly, if you're just some dude on the team someone in the assembly line, I doubt there's much you can do. But if you're in a leadership position, I suggest you get people developing wine-safe builds of your engine. I know a lot of the big studios use forks of forks of forks several years and derivatives down the line of old engines. For example, until Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019, every Call of Duty engine since COD 4 was a fork of a fork of a fork of a fork of the Quake 1 engine, which old stuff. Quake 1 engine worked by design on Linux, but at some point Activision just went Windows, and at some point there's just no way you're going to patch a beast like that to work on Linux. But you can at least poke around in there and see what does and doesn't work on Wine. You'd be surprised with how much Wine can handle now. In the past 2 years, Wine has grown up to be kind of a big boy. It can handle a lot. I know basically every Call of Duty game, except for the really new ones, the past 2 or 3, they work on Wine without any problem. Maybe because they're forks of the Quake engine and Quake was so good. I don't know. Just look at that. Also, please don't do whatever Toys for Bob did. They made a game in Unreal, released it for Windows, and then just kind of quietly ignored the entire Linux community, who basically told them, your game would work fine if you just spend 3 seconds clicking export Linux binary in the Unreal window. Why are you not doing this? Give us ground to stand on. Also, it's a programming dumpster fire. Seriously, if you're playing the game at above 100 frames per second, the physics stops working correctly. That kind of bug does not even exist in Unity or Unreal. They had to have added it themselves. What were they? Not the time. Not the time. Secret surprise. I'm going to trash talk Ubisoft a little bit because their Uplay launcher is hot garbage. Most of the games on Uplay work perfectly fine on Wine, but the Uplay launcher is so exceptionally bad that until recently, just trying to run it on Wine would take my entire computer down with it. That kind of problem shouldn't exist in the first place. I don't know how they pulled that one off. And EA, Origin. Oh my God. Who designed Origin? Origin, when I'm trying to play Titanfall 2, will just periodically crash. No rhyme, no reason, no pattern. If I'm unlucky, Origin crashes. It takes Titanfall 2 down with it, it takes Steam down with it, and if I'm unlucky, it takes my kernel down with it. This should not be possible, especially not on Wine. You don't have that much power. How did you get that much power? Which is why I say, avoid launchers. Titanfall 2 works perfectly. It's Origin that holds it back, at least from the perspective of somebody who plays games on Wine. Rant over. Last words. If you're releasing a game on Steam, check the ProtonDB page for it. Anyone who plays their games on Linux will test it, see what they need to do to make it run, see what doesn't work, crash logs. The people on ProtonDB are really smart. They will find the weirdest fixes for the weirdest games, and they'll say, if you just do this, it works. Perfect example, a game called Prototype, published by Activision in 2009. I bought it on Steam, and I found that it would crash during the opening cutscene. I went on ProtonDB. The solution, the problem, I should say, is that I have a Ryzen 5 CPU. That's 6 cores, 2 threads each, 12 threads total, which from the perspective of a game is 12 CPUs. Prototype, for whatever reason, if it sees more than 8 CPUs on the system, crashes during the opening cutscene. Don't ask me why. I couldn't for 100 years dream of why this would possibly be. The solution, there is literally an option in the Linux kernel where you can just tell an application, hey, only see the first 8 CPUs. Not even just pretend the others don't exist. You literally can't see them. You can't access them. You can't nothing. And if you run Prototype in that, it works flawlessly on Wine. In fact, some people report its performance is better than on Windows. So if you're doing everything right, you should be able to go to ProtonDB, and your game should get an overall rating of gold, which means it installs fine, and a little bit of work means that the game works perfectly as if native, or platinum, which is just download, install, it runs perfect. there's also the rank of native, but I feel like if you're making a game run natively, you kind of know what you're doing already. You don't need to be working on ProtonDB. Also, I know I trash talked anti-cheat a little bit. I understand why people who make multiplayer games want anti-cheat. It makes perfect sense. So if you're going to use anti-cheat, specifically the kernel level stuff, this link came up very, very recently. It's called Are We Anti-Cheat Yet? Because games that use easy anti-cheat and BattlEye and them, they don't instantly work on Proton. The developer has to be opt-in. So a lot of developers are saying in interviews and tweets right now, like, hey, the next version of this game will include a patch that enables easy anti-cheat over Proton. And if you go on that list, you'll see just a long list of games that use certain anti-cheat, and they'll say, we don't know if it works or not, or it doesn't work, or the developers say it's going to work, or something to that effect. So if you're going to be using a kernel level anti-cheat, make sure you get on that list. I would advise not putting yourself onto that list, but make a lot of noise on Twitter, Reddit, interviews with Kotaku or whatever, saying, hey, we've got kernel level anti-cheat, but the Proton users it's going to work. We enabled that. Also, Windows Store only releases are not poggers. There's no way to download a Windows Store game on Linux, no matter how hard you try. And believe me, I have tried. So if you're going to release on the Windows Store, at least release somewhere else. The Epic Games Launcher, your own website, Blizzard app, Steam, anything else. Just don't. And for the love of all that's holy, don't do the Minecraft Bedrock thing. If you weren't aware, Minecraft Java Edition works on anything that runs Java. It still runs on Linux just fine. I play it sometimes. It's fine. Then they made Minecraft Bedrock Edition, which they advertise as the big cross-platform Minecraft, Windows 10 Edition, PlayStation 5 Edition, Xbox 360 Edition, Mobile Edition, all singing one song. And they released it on every platform you can think of, except for Linux. Currently, the #1 suggestion on Minecraft.net for Bedrock is make a Linux native release. They haven't responded. Actually, that's not true. In private Discords, some of the developers said that they're working on and off kinda on a Linux build, and they're thinking they may or may not finish. It's a lot of mixed signals. Please don't do that. If you're going to make a cross-platform game, keep the Linux guys in mind. In fact, considering that Minecraft Bedrock runs on everything else already, it seems like it should just run on Linux anyway. Consider, it's on PlayStation 3, and the PlayStation 3 was designed to run Linux. That was in its original building ideas. So if you can get a game running on the PlayStation 3, particularly a game that's also running on Windows and Xbox and whatever else, I don't know why you're not releasing a Linux native build, or at least saying, hey, here's the Windows build. If you can run it on Wine, that's great. Many people have tried to download the Windows 10 edition and run it on Wine. Bad news. It's in the Windows Store. And we're back to square one. So, just don't do that. Don't be Microsoft. I don't like them. Finn. That's all I got. I know there's 22 things in the chat. I couldn't see the chat that entire time, but I didn't want to say anything, so I'll just roll through that and see what happens.
I was looking at the chat. It looks like we had one question from Patrick Mitchell, that is. Is there a different build option for Linux besides the Windows Mac Linux standalone in Unity?
As a guy who doesn't use Unity, I couldn't tell you. I just know that Unity has a way to make things work on Linux. So people who use Unity, now's your chance to step up and be smarter than me.
As somebody who made a build just a couple days ago in Unity, not for Linux though, I wasn't paying attention. I mean, I could open Unity right now and check. I don't know off the top of my head.
I'm pretty sure that is just how you have to choose the Windows Mac Linux standalone and just select Linux from the drop down.
That makes sense.
Yeah, there's just a drop down and build to do Linux.
Yeah.
Owen asks, didn't they not release Bedrock on Mac either? I believe that's true. There are a lot of Mac users in the Please Make Linux thread that are saying we're a Mac household. Please release on Mac too. Owen also asked, what's Sway? That's one of those things that's more about Linux than about game development. So I don't really know if that's a topic I should be talking about here. But to keep it simple, Linux users have the option to configure the way things are placed on their screen. You can have a interface that resembles Mac. You can have an interface that resembles Windows. You can have an interface that's completely distinct. And you can have an interface where things don't stack on top of each other. Like you can move two things in Windows like right to the same spot, right, one on top of the other. Sway is one of those options where no, you can't do that. Everything is just tiles next to each other that fill up the whole screen. But Sway is particularly interesting because it uses a different kind of backend than most common Linux rendering tool backends. I'm being very high level here to the point where I'm getting things wrong. But if you're interested in what a window manager or compositor is, if you're interested in Wayland, if you've ever heard of that, check out Sway, check out Linux, come to Ritlug and complain about Wayland with me every week. Yeah, I very much expect that is the case, Kaylee. It just CryEngine actually is a really interesting case because I can't really speak to Unity and Unreal, and I don't use them myself, but Godot, you can download and install Godot for whatever, Windows, Linux, whatever. CryEngine, there are only Windows installs, but there's a page on the CryEngine docs to compile CryEngine itself on Linux. And then you can make CryEngine games using Linux. I don't know why they didn't just release a binary for it. Maybe it's to prove to the Linux community that there's nothing sus in their binary because you can compile it yourself. That's a common attitude in the world of the penguins. So maybe that's what Cry is thinking. Or maybe they're just too lazy to build it themselves. They're like, it's your problem now, which isn't a thing that bothers Linux people usually. Yellow Dog Linux. I don't know what Yellow Dog Linux is. Enlighten me.
It's the PS3 Linux.
Oh, okay. Julian said, "Hell yeah." I don't know about what, but thanks.
It was definitely whenever you first.
Yeah, it was Godot.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I
think EAC has Linux support now. Yes, but not. EAC had Linux native builds early on, and then it was bought by, I think, Epic, and then they dropped the Linux support, but only kind of. Sometimes it's updated, sometimes it's not. But now EAC's Windows edition has a developer opt-in for working on Proton. They've been in talks with Valve about that, and it's finally been confirmed. Yes, games using EAC can opt in to working perfectly fine on Proton, at least whenever Proton decides to implement anti-cheat stuff, which will probably not be until Steam Deck is released. A lot of words. I hope I didn't bore you all. I know there's at least one person in here who's probably like, I'm just on the art team, man. This isn't my problem.
How to get your art to work on Linux.
How to get your art to work on Linux. So step one, load the PNG.
Draw at 16K so that all the people who have like 16K monitors can see it in full detail.
That's our next.
Thank you, Julian, for making a great Deathloop joke. I kind of walked into that one. I put a 32-bit Linux OS on a laptop from 05 and it runs faster than the HP I bought in 2019. Yeah, that tracks. Windows is a mess. And now that I'm done with the presentation, I don't have to be nice to it anymore.
Anyone, any more questions people would like to ask now before we kick it over to Discord for project sharing?
Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, complaints about EA Origin, complaints about Windows, anything at all. Now's the time to ask, because I'm gonna quietly disappear as soon as this is over, because I may or may not be 3 weeks behind in homework.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, I feel it. Actually, I do want to add a thing because I made a Steam game, Subdivide. I made that with Linux, and I kind of just, like you said, just threw the binaries up and was like, you could deal with it. And I got one extra sale because of that, so it does pay. But it's really easy to get like a Linux virtual machine going and just like check to see if it works, even if it's like lags like hell. You can just download like Ubuntu, the ISO, and then just like download like Oracle VM or whatever it is, and then just start it.
Yeah. I particularly loved that Portal 2 mod, the Gels one. I can't remember the name. It has a Linux native build that it doesn't work. So to run that game, you have to be using Wine, which is hilarious. If you have a Linux native build, the least you could do is make sure it works.
Yeah,
Patrick asks,
make
where
sure
can
it
we ask
opens.
other questions that aren't related to game dev? Yes, it is time to plug the Linux Club. Hello, I'm the vice president of the RIT Linux Users Group, also known as RITLUG. We meet Fridays, Golisano, room 2620, 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. We have a Discord. You can jump in the Discord and ask questions 24/7. There's usually some crazy bastard who's awake at 6 in the morning, willing and able to answer your obnoxious technical questions. And by obnoxious, I mean very, very thought-provoking technical questions. I can drop the Discord link somewhere, or I can just drop the website link. You did ask one question, which is every night they study Linux until 10. That's absolutely correct. Yes, we don't actually go to class. We just pray to the penguin. If there's a Windows button equivalent on Linux, depends. Depends on what kind of flavor of Linux you have installed, or the window manager / desktop environment thing that I briefly touched on earlier. My laptop right now, yes, there is such a thing. It's called the program launcher. It's basically just a Windows button, unless you're referring to the Windows key, which is a little different. It's called Super or Meta, but it doesn't really, it doesn't actually do anything to the kernel itself, but you can definitely program it to do stuff. I have my Super D command bind to just type in a program name and open it. Super Q to quit. You can do all kinds of stuff. It's a lot of fun. You should look into it. You should come to the club.
On the next minute, it's basically the same as Windows. You can just press the super key and then just start typing and launch whatever.
Oh yeah, particularly right here on my laptop, which is Pop OS. I literally just click what would otherwise have been the Windows key, and it brings up the same Windows button corner menu, and I just type in a program like DaVinci Resolve, and it works. Intradasting.